This was a blank ceiling, and Pope Julius wanted it painted. What Michelangelo did with it was absolutely astounding. It took him 4 years. You have a very interesting fold-out picture of this in your textbook. I can only show a small portion of it here on the screen, but if you look up when you're in the Sistine Chapel, you see all of these images, various scenes from the Old Testament. You see here at the very beginning Adam receiving the gift of life from God. And you see a number of things here that are called sibyls, that in ancient legend, these were prophets more or less that told pagans of the coming of a Savior in Jesus Christ. Here's a close-up of this image. It's actually a fresco, a difficult medium to work in, and you have to imagine what it was like to do this, because the composition of it was one thing. Transferring that composition to a ceiling in a room like this is a tall ceiling. To get up on scaffolding from here, to climb up that high, and transfer your thoughts and sketches to sketches on this wall, and then apply these pigments when you're laying on something looking up, must have been a monumental task. And it took 4 years to do it. What Michelangelo laid out here and accomplished was truly astounding. It's one of the great artworks of Western civilization. It required an enormous quantity of sketches like this and studies. This is for one of the sibyls that's pictured. This is the way, using chalk, that Michelangelo would work out his ideas for the positioning of the human body, positioning of a foot, the way it would look, the correct anatomy for the muscles. This all took a great deal of concentration and time, but it's a marvel that he knew so much about the picturing of the body in different poses that he could do this and take on the task of picturing the human body in these various positions that few other artists of the time or even since would attempt to do. And here is a comparison, a very interesting type of a comparison that people at the time would draw between the art of Michelangelo, the statue of the dying slave, and a statue created by Praxiteles hundreds of years before Christ. And you can see a great deal of similarity here in terms of how Michelangelo was able to capture the musculature of the body the same way the earlier sculptor had been able to do. It isn't that Michelangelo is copying this sculptor. Independently, he's learned how to picture the human body in such a natural way that some people even thought his art exceeded the artistry of the Greeks. Let's take a look at a third situation where one of the masters of the High Renaissance, Raphael, where did he learn before he became a noted artist in his own right? The shop that he worked in was owned by the master Perugino, who in his own right was a very well-respected painter who had mastered the techniques of the Renaissance, the atmospheric perspective, certainly techniques of light perspective and chiaroscuro in the shape of the face, linear perspective here, the way that things would recede into the distance. He was a master of all of this. And you see once again chiaroscuro here, lending circularity to this. You can find the other types of perspective present here as well. But the more you look at this, the more you notice he kind of fell into a pattern. The face, the face, the face. They're all pleasant in the very same way. They tend not to have any real distinguishing characteristics, and the drama here is rather subdued as well. So this looks very nice, but it lacks something. It's just a little bit flat in terms of the drama that might otherwise have been depicted. On the other hand, Raphael, who learned from the workshop of Perugino, is regarded as much more of a genius. And it isn't that he chose simple poses. He had to work as hard at the poses that he struck here with numerous sketches as Michelangelo had to work on the Sistine Chapel. But the mastery here in terms of how the face actually drifts off into the shadows, and the way that chiaroscuro is used here, the way that things are handled very naturally, the proportions are just correct. Raphael became much more famous than his master, even though his life ended at the age of 37. He's another one of the masters of the Renaissance that comes late in the Renaissance, in the High Renaissance. His artistry extended to portraits and also a work that I hadn't illustrated here, which is a mythological scene of the nymph Galatea, which is illustrated in your book and discussed on page 318. Very interesting comparison there you'll want to take a look at, a comparison between that and the earlier work by Pollaiuolo. I would strongly suggest you look at that in the textbook and read those pages. Consideration here of a portrait, which is interesting as a likeness, but aside from that, has nowhere near the charm and the character of a scene like this. As Gombrich points out, in this picture, it almost looks as if there's a little worry afoot. This person isn't really looking at us or at the Pope. This person looking at us seems like he's regarding us with a bit of suspicion. What's happening here, and I think Gombrich uses this as a device to lead into the next chapter, is trouble is afoot. This is 1518. By this time, some of the excesses of the church under Julius, a decade or so earlier, had already spurred the beginnings of what would grow into a major divide in the Christian church, the Protestant Reformation. So these people had a reason to be troubled, the intrigues that were afoot at the time. And we'll be taking a look at some of those in chapters to follow.